There have been three big beasties in Scottish politics in recent years, and today, the third one, Nicola Sturgeon, suddenly resigned. Did she jump before she was pushed as leader of the SNP? Well, we've got the other two big beasties, Alex Salmond and Ian Blackford, live on our show tonight as we explore what was behind Sturgeon's bombshell announcement. What does it mean for Scottish nationalism and indeed the whole of the UK political scene? In a long, heartfelt, passionate resignation speech, she acknowledged that she's become too divisive. But with a worrying absence of any other big beasts, apart from those joining us this evening, will her departure boost her party and the independence cause? Or will it be essentially the moment where we've seen peak SNP, peak Sturgeon? It's all over. After all, the SNP is up against a few gigantic, perhaps insurmountable roadblocks to their dream of breaking up the union and going their own way. Beyond the fact that, according to the most recent polling, the significant majority of Scots are actually against it. Brexit sent them into a complete frenzy. They're desperate to rejoin the EU, but they can see just how challenging it's been for the UK to leave the EU. Imagine, after 300 years, how much worse it would be for Scotland trying to leave the rest of the UK. Extraordinary. We've been joined at the hip for 300 years.
Well, in a moment, we'll be speaking to the SNP's former leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford. But first, let's hear from former Scottish First Minister, now leader of Alba Party, Alex Salmond. Alex, thanks for joining us. Well, absolute bombshell announcement today from Nicola Sturgeon. Did you see this coming?
No, I didn't, Isabel. It took me by surprise, and I think it took everybody by surprise. You might get one or two journalists claiming they knew all along, but I don't believe them. I think everybody was fair astounded this morning.
What do you think is behind her decision? I mean, she was at pains in that very long resignation statement to emphasise that it's not short-term pressures. I think that was an allusion to the very toxic trans rights row that has been bubbling around for the last few days. So if it wasn't that pushed her over the edge, what do you think it was?
I don't know, Isabel. I mean, I certainly don't think it was the trans reforms, the transgender rights reforms. I mean, that was a difficult situation, and Nicola made missteps. She was losing support. It was damaging independence. But, you know, that's the sort of thing where if you come to a compromise, if you settle it, if you do a compromise with your rebel backbenchers, you know, government's difficult. You come into difficulties and challenges, but usually what happens is you deal with them and then move on. So it wouldn't have done long-term damage to the independence case or indeed to the SNP if it had been settled. And similarly with other things that are going on at the present moment, there's huge problems in the health service and the education system. There's this problem with the bring back bottle return scheme. But I mean, these are things which it's the job of government to face them and to overcome them. So I don't rate these. That's why I was so puzzled. I don't see in any of these any insurmountable difficulties. And I suppose the real question about my surprise is Nicola was midstream in a two-pronged strategy. She had gone to the Supreme Court, got a knockback. She said she was going to have a de facto referendum in next year's general election, and she's halfway through that strategy, which seems an extraordinary time to step down. I
mean, perhaps the problem is that the strategy is going nowhere. You'll have seen the Lord Ashcroft polling from earlier in this week, which shows a quite significant margin in favour of staying in the union. Every which way she's turned, it looks like her campaign was going nowhere. Perhaps that's the problem. That's the reason she's quit.
Well, you know, polls come and go. I mean, if we'd been having this discussion 6 weeks ago, you'd had a run of polls showing a significant majority in favour of independence. And, you know, I think the reason for recent poll disappointments for the SNP and indeed for independence was in the difficulties she'd got herself into. But the way you do that is you overcome these difficulties and move on. I mean, the underlying position is that support for independence and staying in the Union is about 50-50. Now, I can just remind you, Isabel, when I called the referendum in 2012 for 2014, support for independence was about 30%. So even that's not a reason. I find it very perplexing that, that
Alex,
this is a moment she chose to go.
Alex, essentially, the three big beasts of Scottish politics, Nicola Sturgeon, yourself, Ian Blackford, you've all recently, relatively recently, stepped down. I mean, what next? What for you, Alex? Is this possibly the moment where actually, almost a bit like Boris Johnson, you're tempted to go back?
Well, can I say that? I think the SNP will elect a new leader and therefore a new First Minister. And what happens to the SNP and to Scottish politics will depend on what that person does. I mean, I get these sort of celebrations from the Tory and Labour people saying, oh, this is wonderful, we'll have it all our own way now. I saw the same celebrations after the referendum in 2014, and 6 months later they lost all their seats. So it really depends what type of leadership the national movement gets, and in particular where you have a leader who will reunify the movement and bring all parties, all parts of it together, perhaps in an independence convention.
Alex, could that be you?
No, the person's going to be the person elected by the SNP. I'm not a member of the SNP. I'm leading a rival political party, ALPA. But you can bring people together through an independence convention, which is once an idea which Nicola supported. And that way you unite the movement and get on with taking on the Unionists and get back to arguing the fundamental case for Scottish independence, which is a case in economic terms, like, you know, why should energy-rich Scotland have 1 million people in fuel poverty? In constitutional terms, it's about the right of self-determination, something you should recognise, Richard.
Right.
Not some of the other issues that the SNP government have got themselves immersed in.
Indeed, but I mean, Alec, the reality is that this campaign for independence is going to take a very high-profile, influential, powerful figure to get it to the next stage. At the moment, with the greatest of respect to those who are likely to throw their hat into the ring, they're not national figures with huge profile. You, by contrast, are. I hear what you're saying. You're currently the leader of another party. It doesn't have any representation. Is there any way back for you, do you think, into the SNP?
Well, ALPA have 2 MPs at Westminster, Isabel, and I mean, that may not seem very much, but when I led the SNP for the very first time some years ago, the SNP only had 4 MPs at Westminster, and now they've got a whole battalion and indeed dominate Scottish politics. So, look, they don't have to be leader of the SNP and First Minister to make a contribution to the independence campaign. And my hope would be that whoever the new leader of the SNP is, and whoever's the new First Minister, he or she will reunite the movement and get everybody from various political parties, but even more importantly from the cross-party and non-party groups, groups like Commonweal, who've come up with some terrific policy ideas for an independent Scotland. We get all these people working together in an independence convention. Thank
you, Alex. Brilliant. Well, let's bring in Ian now. Ian, good evening. Thanks for joining us on Piers Morgan Uncensored. So, this was a massive shock to most people. It may or may not have been to yourself. But what's happened here? Has Nicola Sturgeon realised that she'd become too divisive a figure, or is there something else involved?
I think the fact is Nicola's been involved with the SNP all her adult life. She's been First Minister since 2014 and indeed was Deputy First Minister before that, right back to 2007. So she's had a long time in frontline politics, a long time in government. And I think she's taken the decision that it's right that she has a bit of me time, that politics, being in government, is something that is all-consuming. It's 24/7, it's 365 days a year. Alec knows that. And I think she's taken the decision that, given that she's been in office for so long, it is time to move on. And it's time that, I think, having laid the foundations for the SNP to move on and to be able to put that case for Scotland to become an independent country, that she wants to pass that baton on. I'm saddened. I didn't want her to go. But I think it's right for her that she's taken the decision that she has. It may
be right for her, but what about for the SNP? Is this a moment of new opportunity, new revival for the SNP, or actually is this sort of, we've seen peak Sturgeon, peak SNP, and it's a sort of gradual slide down the slippery slope for you?
we would never take anything for granted, Richard, but we've, of course, been in government in Scotland since 2007. Nicola's won every election that she's fought as leader, beginning with the Westminster election in 2015. We have, of course, a Westminster election coming down the tracks at some point in the next 2-year period, just under 2-year period. We've got a Holyrood election in 2026. We've got to make sure that we can enforce the mandate that we were given by the people of Scotland at that last election. And when Alec talked about democracy, but the simple fact remains, Richard, that there is an independence majority in that parliament. We often hear about this being a union of consent. So what are the circumstances that the people of Scotland can rightfully have their say in their country's future? And I know a lot of the discussions that we have are about process, but at the end of the day, we need to have that debate about Scotland's future, about putting...
Well, I mean, unfortunately for you, process is the great roadblock to this. I mean, Westminster will not allow you to have this referendum that Nicola Sturgeon said she wanted to have. You can't overcome that. You can't short-circuit it. To what extent was the division within the party over whether the next election should be a de facto referendum on independence one of the key factors for Nicola Sturgeon's resignation?
Well, you know, in the SNP, that's a matter for the members. And what Nicola had recognised that the party was going to have a conference to debate those matters. That will still happen at some point in the very near future. But, you know, you've raised tonight on a couple of occasions the issue of the transgender recognition bill. There's something quite extraordinary that's taking place, actually, because that was a bill that was passed by a majority of parliamentarians, cross-party, support of MSPs of every party. It was a matter which was in the manifesto of a number of parties at that last election. But we're now in the situation that before that bill got royal assent, the Secretary of State for Scotland has used his powers enshrined in the Scotland Act to strike down that bill. And that's an extraordinary set of circumstances.
Which Westminster's entitled to do. Just finally, Ian, we must ask...
yeah, but that's a very important position of democracy and the rights and the respect that has to be shown to the Scottish Parliament, Richard.
No, indeed. So are you tempted to throw your hat in the ring, Ian? I mean, this is your big chance, your big moment.
I will support whoever the new leader is, but fundamentally, we're talking about someone that becomes the leader of the SNP and becomes the First Minister of Scotland. You really have to be a member of the Scottish Parliament to stand in this election.
Well, thank you very much, Ian Blackford, for joining us. Thank you to discuss that extraordinary news.
That was extraordinary. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Alex.
And I totally was not expecting this today. And it is true to say there have been quite a lot of rumblings about Nicola Sturgeon's political future, and particularly in the wake of that Ashcroft polling, which was, you know, however Alec and Ian tried to frame it, it was pretty negative for them.
Yeah, my sense is that actually she recognised she was too divisive. My sense...
She said that,
and she said that. My sense is that actually this could be good for the SNP. It might be a sort of moment of renewed interest, different personality, new blood, fresh blood. So yeah, I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating. But of course, if it's someone, they're all both slightly hedging their bets there as to whether they would stand. It seemed to me.
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of process issues there, aren't there?
Absolutely.
I mean, they're not both in a position to do so, but I think Alex Salmond would probably love to do it if he could.